Hi, I'm Brandon Charles. I graduated from U Chicago's Public Policy Master's Program last year. I did just a one-year version of the master's program. I'm a PhD student at Syracuse University now in the Public Administration Department. And prior to that, I worked in the electric utility industry for about a decade. So I took maybe a long and unusual path to get here, but this is what I'm up to now.
Great little synopsis. That was a good elevator pitch. Okay, so let's dive into your PhD program, and then we'll kind of work a little bit backwards from here. So can you talk more about the program itself, what you are working on, what you plan to be working on, and so
on? Yeah, so public administration's a slightly different approach to public policy than maybe like U Chicago's public policy department takes, for example. There's a bit more emphasis on the public management field, and so some less quantitative and more administrative institution oriented aspects. And also the way the program is structured, it's highly applied. So a lot of our theoretical learning pays attention to how previous work gets applied to different sorts of policy problems, and we do relatively less quantitative theory development, so things like mathematical proofs and the underpinnings of economic or political science theory. So that's kind of the way the program's structured in general. Right now I'm in my first year, so most of my time is dedicated towards fundamental theory coursework. But I'm also spending some time at the moment on some side research projects. So I've one public management oriented piece kind of connecting energy decarbonization research and social impacts to managerial theory. And then I'm also working on a project on distributed energy resource policy in collaboration with some colleagues from our information school. So they're applying machine learning techniques to policy documents, and I'm kind of acting as a subject matter expert from the policy world.
Very cool. Yeah, there is a difference between public policy and public administration. So what is the end goal of doing this program, and like what do you want to do after this?
Yeah, so in a perfect world, right now, I think I'd like to end up with an academic position, and that for graduates of this type of program, that tends to be an attainable goal, typically within similar public administration departments. So you don't see us branching off into econ departments and things like that. But it's an attainable goal, but it's also specific to circumstances in terms of type of research and what institutions want. What different skill sets. So that's in a perfect world. And, if I went into this knowing, that's kind of a high bar. And so if that doesn't work out, there's a number of different think tanks or government organizations focused on research that I'd be interested in too.
Great. And then can you kind of describe what your typical day looks like? I know you're taking a lot of those core classes right now. How often are you meeting with other people in your program? Just kind of what does that look like on a day-to-day basis?
Yeah, so I have a relatively small cohort that's going through the first year coursework with me, and then we also bring in some people from other departments who take some of the same classes with us. So I work with them quite a bit. It's a small enough group that we tend to get together and either talk or more formally work on things together. So I meet with them a lot. One of the things I liked about this program is that they assign a specific advisor to each student as soon as they begin the program. So I meet with my advisor once a week, and there are a couple other professors in my department that work on issues that are really closely related to my interests. So I meet with them less frequently. But say once a semester or something like that, unless I'm kind of actively working on something that they're interested in. That's most of my time, and then I guess my days are structured around. I I tend to structure them like a work day. So I'll say I'll have 2 classes in a day that are an hour and a half each, and I'll try to, plan out some work blocks for different projects or different, subsections of reading and stuff like that during the course of the day. So I, not spending too much time at night, staying up late and working on stuff.
When do you expect to be finished with the program? I don't know. Are all PhDs the same length? It's just really based on how long it takes for you to do your research. Can you give some more insight into that?
Yeah. So I don't know about other programs. I think a lot of policy ones tend to be similar in that the average time to completion is about 5 years, and there's kind of a typical range of 4 to 6 years. But there are people who, for different reasons, either finish in 3 years or take quite a bit longer. And so both, depending on your needs and interests, both things can kind of both of those paths can kind of work out too. I'm looking probably at 5 years as an ideal completion time, because for me, I don't have a really specific research project I want to dive into right away. I have kind of a broader subset of interests that I'd like to develop a research base around. And so that kind of lends itself more to, a 5-ish year timeline than, the really rapid 3 years, get your coursework done, do a dissertation and get out. Yeah. I do have another person in my cohort that is pursuing that timeline though. So it is doable with some, advanced planning.
At what point do you, 1, decide what you want to do for your dissertation, and 2, start working on it? Is that something after all of your main coursework is done, or is that like right away?
It's a little of both. So the program is structured so that our first year coursework kind of intentionally guides us to developing research proposals that could contribute to our dissertation, but we're not under any pressure to have a specific dissertation project or proposal until, after we get through our first 2 years, which, consists of some basic comprehensive exams and then field specialization exams. And then you kind of get to the point of proposing a dissertation topic. One of our course requirements is a PhD seminar where we develop and present a research paper in our second year. And so that's kind of designed as like a baby step into the dissertation proposal process. So that's explicitly designed with the intent that that paper will kind of lead into your dissertation work.
Do you have any inkling on what you want to do, or like very open to ideas right now?
In terms of, I'm very open and still trying to figure things out in terms of, methodologies and, specific outcomes of the research. I'm really focused at the moment on different labor impacts as a result of energy transition policies. So the idea that different states are enacting policies to transition away from fossil fuels, and those policies kind of have downstream impacts in other states outside of those jurisdictions on different pools of labor. And so I'm curious both what happens to that labor and then how that labor reacts by, either moving around geographically or between different industries.
Okay. So far, what have you found that you like best about the program, and what have you found to be really challenging?
What I've liked best is especially in your first 2 years, when yes, there's a lot of coursework, but it's less grade oriented than master's coursework, which is really nice. And it's kind of a license to spend 2 years, exploring your interests. And so if to the extent you have reasonably well-defined interests and have some level of self-motivation or intrinsic motivation on that stuff, it's a license to spend 2 years, thinking about stuff you find interesting. The flip side of that is there's a fair degree of independence. And so, while the program is structured to bring each individual along in a reasonable way, there is a lot of, responsibility placed on each person to kind of, progress their own thinking and research and reading outside of coursework.
Right. So can you explain a little bit how you got to this program and what your path was there? You went right from Harris. So was the plan always to be master's and then PhD? Is it something you decided while you were at Harris? Tell me what your thought process was.
Yeah. So I applied to Harris as part of, well, actually in conjunction with some initial PhD applications. And I kind of knew that, at least for the programs I was interested in, typically people get master's degrees before being accepted into them, either because it's required by the program or because it just gives you an enormous advantage relative to others. So I did the Harris Masters with the intent of, kind of boosting my application profile to PhD programs. And it was also, I had been working for a while at that point. And so I don't know that I really explicitly thought this at the time, but having the, transition back into academic life and whatnot has actually made this year quite a bit easier. So I'm glad I had the master's year before starting the PhD. So this was kind of the planned outcome, or the best case outcome, of do the master's and then get a shot at the PhD program. That's a really good fit.
So you were in the workforce for, you said 10 years, a good amount of time. What was the change that you decided that you needed to go back to school?
Yeah, and it wasn't even that I felt like I had to, but my work led to a lot of interests that weren't necessarily related to my current career work, and I kind of both wanted some time to explore different substantive interests, and then I was kind of interested in developing a skill set to be a more independent researcher, as opposed to an industry professional who's knowledgeable but kind of exists in a specific area of knowledge. And so, just to provide a little more context on that, I spent most of that time working as a consultant on utility markets and utility regulatory policy. And so in certain areas, I knew a lot, but that information doesn't always translate really well into studying new topics. So for example, if I worked a lot on utility pricing, but if you dive into issues in a new state or in a new area of the industry, you typically need to find mentors to kind of bring your knowledge along. And I wanted to kind of step back and have a base to say, well, now I have a research toolkit that I can kind of apply to new problems. And so I can branch out that way a little more independently. The other thing is, I described my research interests as kind of falling out naturally from some of the state policies that affect electricity generation and decarbonization in that area. And so it was kind of a natural progression from some of the stuff I did professionally to dive into these other issues that are kind of a different body of knowledge.
You said there were five total, so 4 other students in your cohort. What are some of the career paths that those students have had? Did they do something similar to you, or what happened?
No one has had a career path similar to me. We actually have a really interesting diversity of folks. So we have one person who essentially went straight from undergrad to master's to our PhD program. We have another person who worked for a relatively brief period of time before returning to get a master's and then pursuing the PhD. We have another person who's right around 30 years old and worked in quite a bit of time in as a facilitator for group meetings and specifically in collaborative governance. So much different perspective than I have, but also, a similar amount of depth in terms of, time spent in the field and with that subject matter. And then the final person was actually an Army officer for at least a decade, if not more. And so he's studying he's studying policing policy and specifically the role of military veterans in police forces, and has some really interesting perspective to bring to that. And he'll actually be an instructor at West Point following the program. So he's on a different trajectory, but it's actually the range of people is really helpful in terms of giving us all kind of fresh perspectives on how we think about things.
Yeah. In public administration, just as public policy has many different topics you can go under. Is there anyone else in your cohort who's more of the energy side, or are a lot of people just across the board on different ideas?
Not in my cohort, but it's actually kind of a cool structure in the sense that I go through general courses with people who focus on much different issues than I do, but more vertically within the program, there's at least one person, in each of the cohorts above me, and in some cases two people who don't necessarily study the same issue, but have closely related, energy and environmental type interests. So they're both kind of mentors and also, colleagues to talk about this stuff with. So it's actually an interesting cross section of people to
that was going to be my next question, is we get to connect with them and brainstorm, bounce ideas off of them.
Sorry that I preempted you a little bit.
It's okay. I have more questions, don't worry. On that mentor track, actually, you did mention that you have an advisor or a mentor at school. Have they helped you so far in establishing anything? I know this is very new, but if not them, have you had an advisor or a mentor in the past who kind of helped you or guided you to kind of where you are right now?
So I'd say I had really good mentors at each stage of my career that were really helpful. So specifically in this program, my advisor is great. And that's, like I said before, that's at least something I thought was an advantage of the program, that you have a person from the very beginning to be an advocate for you when you need one, and also to kind of guide you in terms of like, well, it's not that this is a bad idea, but you might be going down a path you're not going to be happy with in 2 months right now. Or, I've come up with some good opportunities for development for you, that sort of thing. And that can be really helpful, especially in your first year when you're still trying to figure out, what to do in terms of your own research or how to approach people who you want to work with in the future, that kind of thing. And then, if I back up, I had a fantastic Harris mentor who was really helpful in terms of, offering suggestions about life at Harris, or, making the most of U Chicago, and also, potential professional connections or just interesting people to meet in the future, that sort of thing. And similarly, backing up in my professional life, like having at least one person you work with who's a bit senior, but very accessible and willing to kind of take extra time on projects to bring you along in terms of skill set and knowledge, but also, advise you on squishier aspects of the job and how to be successful and that sort of thing are really helpful.
Were any of those mentorships like established or given to you? Some organizations, pair you up with someone, or did you personally reach out to anyone to create that mentor relationship?
So my grad school ones have been, at least to some degree, arranged by the school. So I think you're probably familiar with the way Harris does it, with kind of the two-sided matching process. And with the PhD applications, you typically, in your personal statement, as part of the application, highlight faculty who you may want to work with. And in this case, they try to pair a faculty member who shares your interests and has the time to advise a student, with you based on what you've expressed. In my professional life, they weren't. I worked at a relatively small consulting firm and spent a bit of time with a startup-ish company. So neither of those companies had formal mentoring programs. It was just people who I tended to work with a lot and got along with, and it sort of worked out that way. I could certainly see in a bigger organization, a more formal program would be really advantageous though.
So let's move on to Harris then. So already talked a little bit about your path to Harris to the PhD program. So we can skip over that though. So you did 1 year at Harris. Can you explain what that program was?
Yeah, so the program I did is just called the MA in Public Policy, and so it's essentially a shortened version of the Master's in Public Policy program. So it focuses on a couple terms of coursework. It gives you slightly more flexibility as far as the first 2 terms of core courses, and that you get to skip out on one core course and take an elective instead. Which I took advantage of. But other than that, it's very similar to the MPP program. So it's distinct from the kind of pre-quantitative PhD track master's program that Harris also has. And I know a few people who did that as well, the certificate in research methods version of the program. So this one's structured a little more generally. And is probably more appropriate for people who aren't pursuing, like an economics PhD type track.
So besides learning how to be a student again, what did you walk away with from Harris? Like, what were there specifically anything that your time there helped you with, or just overall? What are some major lessons that you've learned?
Yeah, beyond just revisiting being a student, I think Harris takes a unique approach to public policy in general, and even to quantitative methods. And so for me right now, Harris's approach to teaching things like econometrics, quantitative methods and whatnot is very helpful, and even the approach to political science that Harris takes have been really, really valuable, both analytical toolkits and perspectives to have going into a different type of program. So I really appreciated that. And then 2 other important things for me were the opportunity to work with EPIC. So I worked with Mark Templeton on utility climate change adaptation issues. And so that was, despite having spent a lot of time in that industry, that was an issue I really hadn't explored a lot. And so, it's not what I'm currently researching, but it's actually been a very valuable perspective to have to kind of, broaden the way I think and approach different audiences and issues just in that subject area. And then similarly, I kind of, the elective I took instead of one of my core courses was kind of a hedge in case the PhD applications didn't pan out. So I took a policy lab that was focused on implementing carbon pricing in Illinois, and that was another really valuable experience, both because if I needed to find a new job, that was a new a new issue I'd learned about, and a new issue I had developed some contacts in exploring and that sort of thing, but also just again, kind of having exposure to a different set of markets or geographies and individuals, and the way they approach problems in a similar industry was really valuable. So those are 2 things that were super helpful. But I also had a really good time just talking with different people from Harris, and we were all at different points in our careers, but it was still really valuable to have the chance to hear what other people think and kind of just think about the stuff with them.
Cool. Were you involved with anything at Harris or outside of Harris that added to any of your skills or interest in energy?
Yeah, so besides getting the chance to work with EPIC a bit,
we'll talk about that later. Go on.
Yeah, so I unfortunately went to Harris during the dark year where everything was on Zoom, and nobody got to have any fun. But that said, that I still spent some
time. Is that what they're calling it? The dark year?
That's what I'm calling it. I don't think it's official.
Okay.
But let me know if I should trademark it. If you think
I like it.
But I did spend some time with a couple of the student organizations. So specifically the urban policy and energy and environment ones. And we were kind of limited in what we could do, but we still managed to have some pretty good Zoom events and hear from interesting people. And like I was saying, those were in a weird Zoom year. Those were particularly good ways to connect with people with similar interests and have a little bit of an outlet from classwork on some more fun stuff.
Outlet from Zoom for more Zoom.
Well, when you put it that way, yeah. Now's a better time to be in grad school.
Sorry, missed it. Any advice for specific courses for people to take? Or did you have a favorite course from Harris or a favorite faculty member? Anything like that?
Yeah. So three thoughts on that. I really love taking advanced statistics is probably not something that many people think of as exciting, but I loved Dan Black as a professor. So I really enjoyed having him for that class. The class was a bit challenging, but yeah, he seems to really enjoy teaching it, and it was it's becoming ever more valuable that I learned it the way he teaches it. So that was great. In terms of subject matter, if you're trying to develop some energy subject matter expertise, before getting a job and whatnot, the physics and technology for policy wonks class was really enjoyable. And I think a good one for getting kind of a broad perspective of big issues in energy policy. And then the last one is Professor Kaustis's household finance class, which is not really directly related to my research, but he was a really fun professor, approached the subject matter in an interesting way. And I actually think it gives a really useful perspective for just like thinking about how people behave, how they react to different sorts of economic developments or policy issues, that sort of thing. So highly recommended.
Great. So you were a Bartlett Fellow with EPIC during this time. I don't know how much time you had, if you had any opportunity for other internships, or do you have any other type of internship opportunities? It could be like all the way from undergrad that you want to talk about that were helpful in this route, or even that had nothing to do with what you're doing right now. And then we'll talk more about the Bartlett Fellow program.
Sure. Yeah. So, well, going back all the way to undergrad, I didn't really do any work related to, or at least not directly related to what I ended up doing professionally. So I worked for a small economic development association in upstate New York one summer. I worked for a real estate development company another summer, and took a term off to study abroad. So those things were all really fun and kind of like good general learning experiences. I wouldn't say they directly, translated into a future career, other than like, you learn good social or professional skills from any of those sorts of things. I did work for 3 years before getting into the energy industry. And so, they were full-time jobs, but in a sense they were kind of like trial, like internship type experiences that ended up really helping me later. So, I did a lot of detail oriented, just general research and support work for a law firm, and similarly for a trade association in Washington, D.C. for a couple of years. And, they didn't end up, those weren't what led into the job I ended up really wanting and getting, but they, gave me a chance to think about what industry I wanted to work in, what type of job I really wanted, and then some skills that were very helpful when I first got there in order to be able to contribute to projects right away without necessarily knowing a lot.
Absolutely. So you were a Bartlett Fellow with EPIC, which is a fellowship available to your students. Can you talk a little bit more about what you worked on, what the outcomes were with that? And I put in the chat box the link to the fellows page, so if anyone wants to check that out.
Yeah, so like I was saying before, I focused mostly on utility climate change issues, and so what we were doing for much of the year was kind of exploring how state policymakers and state regulators, and then how utility companies are approaching the issue of adapting their systems to changing climate conditions. So this is somewhat distinct from preparing the electric grid for storms. It's more preparing the electric grid for bigger storms or more frequent storms. And
is this similar to what's happening in Texas, or no?
No, it's potentially it's closely related in the sense of I think at least some scientists argue events like that, or the heat wave a couple summers ago in California, are exacerbated by climate change, and that's kind of pushing them outside of the engineering design parameters of the existing grid. And so we were thinking about how do you integrate the latest science into typical planning processes? How do these organizations need to think differently? Because a lot of them have engaged in climate change mitigation. They haven't thought of it as much about systematic ways to adapt systems so that they continue to operate reliably. And ultimately, actually, one of the work products that came out of this was an op-ed that Mark and I wrote together for Forbes on the Texas crisis, and kind of commenting on how that relates to some of the shortcomings in the existing policy and planning processes, and throwing out some ideas on how we might do a better job of kind of connecting the dots of where there are emerging risks and where there might be existing gaps in the system. Marguerite, I think you may have accidentally muted yourself.
I am on mute, yes.
Sorry.
I am going to find that Forbes article. I'm going to put it in the chat box because I remember this now. Okay, that's a good kind of jumping point to just kind of the future. And I mean, you have a little bit until you're done. Sorry. But if you had a dream job, you already said the track you would want is, get into academics. But if you could think of a dream job that doesn't have to be related to this at all, what would that kind of be? Or if you want to relate to it, like what would you be doing in academics? Mostly teaching, mostly research, just kind of what does that look like?
Yeah, I think if I were to describe it without saying academia or consulting or think tank or whatever, I'd say I'd like to be able to do my own research, kind of digging into how changes in the energy system are affecting society, affecting the economy, and affecting climate and environmental goals. And then it's important to me to have an opportunity to be able to translate that sort of analytical work into more actionable advice. So I'm kind of hoping to have an opportunity to engage, with policymakers or administrators or industry professionals to kind of connect the dots between the academic or strictly analytical research to how does this kind of relate to the real world. And so I think then I think teaching is actually kind of a natural companion to that, because that's, in a lot of ways expressing, how do you relate the academic or analytical world to kind of practical outcomes, or how do you show people how to make use of one for the other, that sort of thing.
Yeah. And then last question before we go to Q&A, what advice would you give students who are starting to think about their futures, whether it's going into a job, going into a PhD program? What kind of advice would you give?
I think the first one, and it maybe goes without saying for people at University of Chicago, but I think whatever your first opportunity is, it's really important to kind of develop a core skill set and find ways to use that to engage with your colleagues. So in the sense of, like, I started off with relatively basic research skills, but because they turned out to be, reliable and fairly detail oriented, I made relationships with people who, put me on additional projects and that sort of thing. And so it's kind of a virtuous circle that developed into a mentorship. And so that's one way of approaching any job, even if it's kind of not in your top 3 or 4 or 5 choices in terms of the specific subject matter or whatever. And I think that goes for even thinking about, what types of jobs might be the right one from the get-go. So I think a lot of people I've worked with have benefited from, maybe finding more general jobs that give them a greater depth of experience in their first couple of years, either post-undergrad or postgraduate school, and then kind of transitioning into a more specific subject matter related role. But it's certainly possible if you really know you want to be an energy analyst. There's a lot of jobs out there that you can jump into. It just might take a bit more searching.
Great. So Q&A is open now. So if you have a question for Brandon, just go ahead and raise your hand. I will ask you to unmute, and you want to accept that unmute, and then say your name, your program, and then ask your question. But until you guys ask anything, we'll keep chatting. So I will keep an eye and see if anyone's raised their hand. Otherwise, we're gonna go back and talk a little bit more about PhD program and some of that other kind of stuff. So again, raise your hand when you're ready. All right. So you said you were working on a handful of projects right now. Can you talk a little bit about, there were multiple, either all of them or pick one of them that you like the most, and go a little bit more in detail about what that is and like what the outcome will be on that.
Yeah, so I'll start with one, which is the paper I've been working on about administrative approaches to energy governance, and that's something that came out of my first term coursework. So one of our courses was based on public administration theory and the history of development in the field. And so one thing I worked with our instructor on quite a bit in that class was kind of connecting that stuff to my interests. So I'm not necessarily going to be a public management scholar, but there are some interesting issues to think about in terms of, if you think that policies will be needed to kind of smooth the transition for different segments of the labor force as we switch to different energy resources, it's worth thinking about the practicalities of doing that from the perspective of different government agencies, so administrators, either at the federal or state or local level. And so this paper kind of explores different characteristics that you might see in different regions of the country, as far as transitioning away from coal resources, for example. So in some areas, there might be kind of a one-to-one relationship between some coastal state decides they're going to implement a clean energy policy, and therefore a very specific, set of coal power plant and coal mining interests shut down. And so there's kind of a nexus between, 2 or 3 or 4 states. And in other cases, you're kind of talking about these larger deregulated wholesale markets where it's kind of unclear who's making the decisions to switch away from coal and what are the specific impacts of that. And so how you approach addressing negative fallout might vary depending on those situational characteristics. So that's kind of what that's exploring, and it's been a fun thing to think about and dabble in, at least, and a fun side project to have at the beginning of this term.
Cool. We do have a question. So Jamina, I'm going to ask you to talk, and I'm sorry if I said your name wrong. Please correct me.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yep.
Okay, I'm Jimena, almost right. Thank you for hosting this. Thank you for the information. I am an incoming student. I was just admitted to the MSCAP program at Harris, so I will be starting in September. I currently work for an electricity company here in Canada, specifically focused on electrification programs and demand side initiatives. So I'm very excited about EPIC, and I'm just wondering what's the best way to get involved, and how do you go about contacting a professor and maybe trying to get involved with research outside of school?
It's kind of a question for both of us. Their EPIC has graduate fellowships available, like the Bartlett Fellowship and the DRW Fellowship. Brenda, do you want to talk a little bit more about the application process for that and how that went?
Yeah. So I applied before I had actually started school. I think the application for
the application for
the academic year fellowships, I think, opened in late August or so.
Yeah.
I think that's right. It was sometime right before math camp. But anyway, so I had to pull, as an incoming student, I kind of had to pull some material together pretty quickly to do it. But the way it works is on the Harris job board, you'll see postings from different professors who have Bartlett Fellow positions. And so each one of them will have kind of different, each one of them are kind of different jobs because the professors are looking for different skill sets. So depending on your background, you might be, especially as an MSCAP student, you might be really well suited to some of the more analytical economics professors type projects, or in my case, I had done a lot of regulatory work, so I was a good connection with a law professor who was really focused on that area. So you can kind of pick which ones correspond to either the projects you're most interested or the skill sets that are best fit for you.
Oh, all right, thank you. So I'll stay tuned and maybe check the board around August for opportunities.
Yeah, so we post those also on our website. I just put that in the chat where we post all the individual ones for each of the faculty. And yes, there's a summer fellowship, and there's also an academic year fellowship. The academic year fellowship, I think, comes out in August. I'm just taking over this program, and this is my first year in it, so I'm still learning it as I'm going. So then we also have the applications for the summer internships come out in the spring, so more like April. And you can keep an eye on that through our website. We'll also tweet about it. And if you join our newsletter, we'll have information about that as well. Okay. Anybody else? That was a good question. I've never had a question like that. I got to answer part of a question in the Q&A. So exciting for me. So we talked about your projects already. What else? Are there any current trends or issues in the field right now that we should be aware of? Obviously, a lot of the stuff is very timely with what's going on with all of the utilities right now. Are there any other things that we should know about, or any other newsletters or Twitter accounts that we should follow to stay up to date on this kind of stuff?
Good question. So let's see, I'll start with other resources. So I really like Columbia University's Columbia Energy Exchange podcast, and the different policy papers that they're, I don't remember what they're called, Center for Global Energy Policy, something like that. Columbia's Global Energy Policy Center puts out, they have a lot of interesting, affiliated faculty and professionals and whatever. So they have a lot of commentary coming out all the time. In terms of interesting topics, a lot of the nuances of vehicle electrification's kind of made more mainstream news lately, with the bigger car companies jumping into the mix pretty aggressively. Mm-hmm. I still think the challenge of kind of co-optimizing for a cleaner grid overall and meeting the demand that would be associated with getting to something like 50% of new car sales being EVs is underappreciated. Like, the timeline for achieving this, if we're going to do it, in 7 or 8 years or so, and the degree of technical challenge is really significant, and I think still underappreciated. And then more generally, I think that falls under an interesting suite of emerging demand side management issues in terms of, having multiplying Internet of Things type smart home assets and EV charging and all that kind of stuff that can kind of be aggregated in different ways by utilities or software providers. I think that's all really, really interesting stuff.
Okay, we do have a question in the Q&A. I'm going to read it. I have a bachelor's degree in electrical engineering from Mumbai University in India. I haven't pursued a master's degree yet. I'm working in a think tank as an energy policy RA. Would I stand a chance for the EPIC fellowship without a master's? I guess this is also kind of a question for me. You have to be a master's student to do the EPIC fellowships. We don't have research opportunities for undergrads, but we do have pre-doctoral fellowships. So we have an RA-ship available for people who are going from undergrad and thinking into going to those master's or PhD programs. So there is that middle ground. So if that's something that you are interested in, let me pull up that link and you can check that out. Yeah, so any other questions? Because otherwise we will kind of wrap up. So that link is in the chat. Otherwise, if you go to EPIC's website, under jobs and fellowships, you can find information about the pre-doctoral fellowships and then the Bartlett and the Wilson fellowships. So yeah, that's basically it for today. Unless anyone would like to raise their hand right now, then we're gonna end. So thank you guys so much for joining us. Thank you, Brandon, for being here. We will not have a career series in March. We're going to take that month off with spring break and all of that stuff. And our next one will be back in April. So if you want to, well, I would usually post the link to our calendar, but I haven't updated the calendar yet. So there's nothing on it. But our next one will be in April. So keep a lookout for that. And yeah, so thanks everybody again. Thank you, Brandon, and everyone have a great afternoon.
Thanks.
Bye. And if you do want to get in touch with Brendan for any reason, you can reach out to me and I can get you guys in touch. So yeah. All right. Bye. Bye.